Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. You're with your host, Masha, and your co-host, Claire. And this is our 12th episode where we're going to look at the movie Leave the World Behind. Claire, do you want to give us a little synopsis?
For those who haven't seen it, this is a film that's on Netflix, came out in 2023, and it's based on a novel, but transparency, we have not read the novel. So if you have and you would like to defend it in some way, then please do write to us and let us know. So the premise is basically that a family with a teenage son and a slightly younger daughter, I suppose, or maybe early teens daughter, decide that they're going to take a short break to just outside the city in a little hamlet. They've rented a house and they're going to get away for a few days, sort of short notice decision. But the first night that they are there in this really very luxurious house, they get a knock on the door, and a man and his daughter in her early 20s, I suppose, standing there in full evening dress. And basically it comes to pass that they are the owners of the house, and because of a blackout in the city, they want to come and stay in their house, which the family is already staying in. So that's the sort of premise, but basically what we see is the unfolding of something that appears to be apocalyptic in some way, but without ever a very clear idea, I suppose, of what exactly is going on. And so one of the things that I think is quite chilling about the film is that lack of knowledge, of communication, of any way of knowing what's going on in the outside world other than the little bits of information that they pick up. Yeah, I mean, you thought that it was pretty chilling as films go.
Yeah, I don't know. I think out of all the things I've seen, it's quite rattled me. Probably partly as a product of watching it so late at night. Maybe I'm not sure. I'm not necessarily sure if it was the story beats themselves that were so sort of chilling for me. Potentially it was just the way that the movie was sort of put together. I think especially with, like, the musical element, like throughout the whole entire movie, it was this sort of dissonant, like, sort of string,
like pianos with then series.
So it was like every single bit. I was like, what is that? They're on the beach right now. What is there to be eerie about? Right? I was like, whoa, that's some really sort of not hard hitting scenes, but just kind of very like intense. I'm not even sure how to describe it. I think the point in the movie at which you first sort of notice things going wrong is probably the scene with the oil tanker.
Yes.
Which for those who don't know, big boat, very big, like huge, like really huge boat. Which I didn't think it came across in the first, like, maybe 5 minutes of the scene, which I guess is the same
it's a long
thing.
way off, isn't it? You're thinking, that it's sort of facing this way and so on, and it's the way that they kind of just keep cutting back to it.
Yes,
normality.
I personally thought it was really clever. I feel a lot of people would probably say, I was saying to Claire before we started recording, it's kind of has that like hallmark shiny filmmaker sort of vibe to the movie. You know, it's not the most like cinematically advanced film, but I actually thought it was really nicely done, to be honest.
I mean, there's obviously kind of conscious choices, I think, within the film.
Yes, definitely.
Make decisions. Like, I was watching it lying in bed, which is the second time watching it, and lying on my side and watching these kind of like views from above and the sort of spinniness of the camera.
Yes,
really
it was. It is 100%. I think the camera angles and the movements like add to that. They create that sense of nausea, which I think adds to sort of how unsettled you feel. Especially, we'll get to this in a bit probably, but the bit where Archie, who's the son of the couple, one of the children, when his teeth start falling out, I like jumped out of bed to go brush my teeth.
In many ways, I think the way in which there's no kind of like, it's not like, it's like really functionally gruesome. Like, rather than sort of like overblown, it just feels like this is what it would be like. So I think that's one of the things that is quite striking about the film is the way in which it takes this very small cast of characters in a very normalized situation. Yes, everybody's quite wealthy and so on, and they do go into some social aspects that I'm sure we'll come on to, but by and large you've just got a quite relatable sort of, if you had the money and you're in that sort of situation, you would take your family away for a few days, get away from work, And wouldn't that be nice? And then this sort of radical shift within that. I mean, I think that, you know, there's a lot of sort of slightly overly compressed character arcs and things like that. But we've talked about that before. If you take like a 2-hour film,
it is. I think they did try to add a lot in there, because obviously there's a bit of like a sort of like a class and a race narrative, sort of like intersectional, but it feels very glossed over to me. But again, it is. We were saying, yeah, as you were saying, the ending was a lot of people sort of. I think I was looking at like Rotten Tomatoes and the audience sort of reviews were like, the ending was really disappointing and it kind of came to a bit of nothing, but it's 2 hours and it's such a huge sort of concept to tackle. I mean, it was interesting to me, especially because I don't think I understood, you know, as I was going into this movie, just sort of levels of like cyber attack that you could experience.
I think that's probably quite a good place for us to start, isn't it? The sort of the concept. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of those things that probably most sort of lay people like us don't really. We hear lots about, and you're sort of, you know, well educated in sort of viruses and how not to open attachments and things like that, and we hear about hacks on companies where data gets released, and, you know, you get a sort of apologetic email saying that, you know, somebody's nicked your identity or whatever. So, you know, those are the sorts of things that we know about. But it does play very nicely on the sort of what would happen if you had a really sophisticated, comprehensive cyber attack. And lots of sort of discourse that says, you know, the next great war. I mean, we did talk the other day about sort of, you know, whether a war would look particularly modern, you know, if we have a third world war. But certainly there's been lots of discourse to say, well, no, it will be fought online in many ways. And that's obviously one of sort of the premises here. But you're right, we get this sort of oil tanker, which is very physical, very kind of like grinding into the beach.
Yes. No, I think there's a lot in the movie, especially for me. I think there was a lot of sort of these, like, obviously with it being like a cyber attack, there's a lot of like the transport links, these huge sort of like, it's about like these planes sort of diving into the sea and like these like boats being washed up. I think it's just the size. I think there's a huge sort of size thing, like in terms of scale that they reflect on, but I don't know.
And I think that that's a really important observation in a way, because it's like these huge things that are sort of like, we just assume, you know, planes will stay in the sky and ships will stay in the sea.
Yeah. And so and when you think about it, yeah, like as soon as you lose all contacts and signal, you know, air traffic controllers. I was listening to that podcast that you actually sent me as well, about I think it's like, you know, for the listeners, it's with Robert Sapolsky.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes, because it's playing in my mind as well as but we've mentioned Robert Sapolsky's work before on Free Will. But it's a really good interview with him on Leader.
Yeah, really good. But yeah, I think he mentions how, this is a bit of a side point just because we're on air traffic controllers, and I was like, wow, that's so cool. But he talks about elements of stress and how they can affect, you know, even the career that you sort of go into, and how those people who go into being air traffic controllers and have these like higher levels of stress, sort of ranging for a really long period of time, the whole entire time that they're at work, end up quitting maybe a year or two into the job. Whilst those people who have the ability to basically condense their feelings of stress to a single 30-second period in this sort of 30-second spike end up being way more successful. But it was very good podcast. Claire's recommendation. So
yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And it did make me think, you know, about a number of the sort of things that I think come up here. But one of the things you really, you know, you're right. There's always that question of, you know, the people that are involved. But I suppose there's a little bit of a sort of very slight near future element to this film, isn't there? So it's pretty much as things are now, but with, you know, self-driving cars and so on. So we sort of saw a greater move towards, I guess, you know, automation, AI.
Bigger reliance on like technology and stuff. I mean, even now is huge. I mean, one thing that I was considering is they you know, they talk about a blackout throughout this movie, but there's no actual like physical electricity blackout. Like they're still, if completely the whole entire grid cut out, that would be also completely different.
Yes, I think that's right. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why there's a sort of this decision to set it in this rural environment, this very wealthy, sort of secluded environment that is almost certainly, I guess, independent from the power stations that are running the city. So we've got that idea that they are that step removed from it, which also keeps them isolated from a real awareness of what's going on, and maintains that kind of how serious is this kind of vibe. So, you know, they lose the internet, the TV, the phone, all of that to start with is just annoying. And I really thought they got that bit where everyone is like every 5 minutes going, I'll just go on the computer. Oh no, I'll just get your phone. Oh no, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, you know, that sort of complete reliance, whilst also you know, quite an ignorance of sort of like the details of technology. I think there's a bit where
for sure,
she's like, so Julia Roberts' character Amanda, this middle-aged white woman who works in advertising and hates everybody, she, you know, sort of says, oh, he must be one of those sort of like cybersecurity nuts because it's a really like the password is a novella and so on. Her husband's like, oh, I don't know how to reset a router and so on. So this kind of thing that, you know, or technology just happens. We don't really understand, like, you know, how.
No, 100% not.
So yeah, I thought that was you know, an interesting thing. And so compared to those like minor things like you can't get online versus the sort of huge things of planes literally falling
out of the sky,
and then, you know, it takes it really to an extreme, I think, because there's things like GPS stops working, radio seems to have mostly cut out, we get little bits of radio, and sat phones not working, so suggesting that even the satellites, which are also of course operated by computers, could be taken out in a cyber attack. Kind of shows this kind of microcosm and macrocosm element of
yes.
I'm glad I'm doing the hand actions here, audio format. And there's also something I think about the kind of the personal versus the sort of global, what we see as most personal. So George and his daughter Ruth, the black couple who own the house, the wife is on a plane, or so they assume. So that's that constant tension in the background of she's sort of, you know, sort of a Schrodinger's cat kind of character, because they literally cannot know whether she is alive or dead at that moment. So yeah, so there's a lot of these scenes that on their own kind of, you know, they have more or less weight, but it's that cumulative effect that I think really makes it a very tense film. You know, there's this, there's the big idea of kind of what's going on in the outside world, but there's also quite a lot, I think, about how people interrelate, and that helps build part of the tension, because, well, I suppose we're largely seeing through the eyes of this middle-class white family in a you know, obviously a house belonging to somebody wealthier than they are, but they have paid, you know, $2,000 or something to rent it, so they're obviously not, you know, badly off or anything. And then when the owners come to the door, that moment of fear, which is definitely, at least in part, racially motivated. And you're right, I think, you know, yes, maybe it's glossed over a little bit, but actually I felt it was referenced in quite good ways, the idea that there is a racial element to the assumptions that are being made about this couple. But also, of course, there's just Amanda's character generally, very uptight, husband's a bit more relaxed. So yeah, I mean, what did you think about her reactions, like, to the people at the you know, generally to people, and also specifically to George and Ruth when they come to their own door?
There's definitely a subtlety in the way that they like showed the sort of racial element, which I thought was very like effective. I think my like qualm with it is that I think it was just like sort of in terms of what we're saying with the like sort of character arcs that these you know, people sort of went over. I feel like it was sort of, I don't know, I mean, I think it was dealt with quite well. I don't know, I feel like I need to give it a bit more thought.
I suppose we don't really know whether those tensions are they're not eradicated over the course of the film. They are just alleviated in certain ways, I guess.
Definitely. So, I mean, I think especially I really loved Ruth's character, who I think, you know, she's sort of this very like knowledgeable young person, but also I think, you know, also has the privilege, like, you know, she asks, you know, what Amanda and her husband do, and Amanda's like sort of asking her the same thing, and Ruth says that she's still working it out for herself, where she sort of sits in a place of privilege. But I think both I like the sort of parallels between Amanda and Ruth, because I feel like they have a bit of a bonding moment towards the end of the film when they're sort of, yeah, they're surrounded by these deer and like try and ward them off together, but which is also like an incredibly intense moment. Anyways, yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like they're both informed by their own experiences.
Mhm.
I think there's definitely a bit of probably a bit of racial prejudice coming from Amanda.
Which she herself
Which
acknowledges,
she
like,
herself
maybe not
acknowledges,
quite in as
yeah.
many words, but when she
No,
says to George,
100%.
how badly she treated them when they arrived.
Yeah, and then also, but Ruth's own sort of apprehension about having these people in her house, she's very consistently sort of telling her dad, look, let them go if they want to go. This is better for us. We've only got each other. And, and she sort of says, like, if you're in this sort of situation, in this apocalyptic situation, one of the things that you need to be so sparing of is trust. And she was like, especially giving it to like white people, which is obviously informed by her own experiences as like a Black woman. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard because like you could partly see that like Amanda's reaction to these two strangers coming to her house, especially I think it's very clear in her reaction of when they were saying that it was their house. They're like sort of doubting that, but I think the stranger that like genuinely just having two strangers like stay in your house, I don't know, it's very hard to toe the line because I'm not in a situation similar to her, but you can kind of see it from her perspective. Like, you've got a house with like two children, but I don't know, I think like that you also have to sort of take some things at like face value and see that like clearly these two people are in need of help. And I think having, eventually they sort of put it together and realize, the sort of oil tanker from the beach earlier on and all of the phone lines and the networks going down, etc. Sort of it compiled well, I don't know, maybe part of her refusal to like let these people stay in that house was to try and off-put what she like, as she said, she didn't mention the oil tanker to them when they were sort of putting the storyline together to George and Ruth, who were talking about this blackout. She didn't mention that because she was worried it would confirm her own fears about something.
Exactly. I mean, the fears are really multi-layered, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because, fear of their suspicions being true, fear of individual people, fear of the unknown. I think all of this kind of really comes through. And I think you're right to think that we might hope to be that, the people who would be really generous by the stranger at our door. But you're right, I think that most of us would react like Amanda reacts.
Yeah.
And the thing that made me think about the Robert Sapolsky interview was he talked about putting people in brain scanners and looking at the reactions they have to faces and the way in which when you show Black faces to white participants, it ignites the fear response.
And the amygdala.
So consciously. So and he's not necessarily sort of, he says how bad this is and how much of a problem this is, but he also says it's not about people's kind of choices. He has this theory about sort of free will and the way in which that is something that essentially he's basically saying it's a reaction that is not our choice to make, as it were, which is not to say that he doesn't think that we should be working to get rid of it, but like it's built in from our experiences and our genes and so on, that we get these fear responses. And obviously that's based, as he talks about, in sort of hundreds of years of prejudice, essentially. So I think that much as we would hope to be as anti-racist as possible as we can be on this in this kind of discussion, I think that also the film basically holds up to us a sort of a reality that even a sort of basically decent American family, white family, have a greater fear response because the couple that comes to the door is Black. And so there's a big commentary, I think, on kind of like not just how society treats one another in general, but the way in which the racial element plays into that. But before she knows who they on the doorstep, she's already saying to Amanda, says to Clay, her husband, someone's here, get a bat. So that's like a normal thing to do when somebody knocks on your door. There's a pre-existing level of fear to her, and Clay, of course, is quite, I mean, they're quite an unlikely couple, don't you think?
Although
they're also a couple that's grown over the years, and they've obviously been together for ages. They've got, you know, a 16-year-old son or whatever, Archie is. So there's a bit of that sort of, you know, middle-aged, long married, kind of set in their ways, not quite the same young people that they used to be. But Clay is both way more chill and also like way more panicked when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Clay shows a bit more of that self-awareness or awareness of others, maybe, that Amanda really struggles to do, but we'll talk about kind of the way that fits with her job. But when he says they were scared too, essentially, about George and Ruth, he's like, you know, George keeps things very cool by and large. Very controlled character, considering everything that's happening. And so I think he hides things, but Clay can kind of see through that and is more aware, whereas his wife's kind of like, she goes like, hackles go straight up, and then she can't see past her own experiences, maybe.
Sort of, experiences, prejudices. I mean, I think it's great that like Ruth and George's characters seem very like knowledgeable on what's going on. Like, they're the sort of sharers of, you know, Ruth sort of mentions that bit about the power plant and how, you know, a sort of whole entire area can get hacked from just this one place, wherever this power plant may be, and how I think George, what does he do? He's kind of, isn't he like a financial advisor or something?
That's right,
along those lines. And I think he tells a really like interesting story. I think this is where the sort of like intersection between race and also wealth kind of comes in, where he was talking about one of his clients who would make a lot of, you know, it was sort of this huge guy in the business at the top. He was very wealthy, and how he was saying that like a couple of months or something, or a couple of days ago, before this sort of big apocalyptic event happened, he was like, this sort of client of his rang him up on the phone and was saying, move all of this money around, these big numbers. And George makes a joke to this guy who, you know, sort of usually makes these sort of punchlines and stuff about him going off to hang out with his
evil cabal that rules the world.
Evil cabal, and you know, this guy usually loves a bit of those sort of jokes, but he just doesn't laugh. And so you can kind of, I don't know, I think that those sorts of scenes where it was just them, like it was Amanda and George sat at the, like, you know, this table having a drink, and George sort of, he just, you know, he sort of seems a bit like a man on the inside.
Obviously, one of the things I think that you know, the film is therefore doing is to sort of challenge some of the prejudices that Amanda holds, and that maybe kind of a white viewer holds, actually, where you know, because we really are kept in the dark to start with. Were you feeling like this could be some trick, conspiracy, something dodgy, or just, you know, I think that they do keep us thinking that it could be.
I mean, I think there's also like the mention of the like I love you bug, which actually I'd heard about like even before, where sort of it's, I don't know, I'm sure listeners know, but it's like this sort of little like spam email that you'd receive, and when, you know, upon opening it, it would like send that same email to all of your contacts, and it like sort of broke down whole businesses. And
that's right. It's sort of before, I think, you know, there was a greater awareness, but also it's just that simple. We're recording this on Valentine's Day, by the way, everybody. I feel that, you know, you get a nice email that says I love you, click on it, and you know, I think that one of the points that's being made there is that we are aware of cyber attacks. We're not always aware of the kind of the motivations, because that to be a couple of teenagers in the Philippines, and there's sort of the malevolent hacker, and there's the sorts of obviously hackers who sort of want to hack things to prove that they can, and then there's the sort who are doing it for, you know, particular political purposes, or there's the sorts of people who basically don't really think about the consequences, like that example, and then there's the fact that all of these same skills can be used for something damaging.
Again, you sort of hear all the time about those stories of like these teenagers who's, you know, have like learned these skills themselves and have hacked like huge like government databases like the Pentagon and something. And again, I think it comes from that probably ignorance of technology, that you sort of just sit there and assume that like there are all these sort of firewalls protecting all of your like personal information and stuff, but all that stuff isn't automatically set up for you or exist. Like, it has to be put in place. Like,
it does. And of course, you know, I think that we have various awarenesses, levels of awareness, I suppose, kind of technological awareness of, I suppose, from the sort of person who falls for a spam email. And, you know, I don't think that is exclusively the sort of old and ignorant. I think that they're, you know, I've had colleagues who've buggered the entire system of the school by clicking on an attachment. You think, you know, these are reasonably intelligent professionals, and they still do it, through to the idea that obviously even major banks, for example, you know, are only as good as their programmers on their security system being better than the programmers who are hacking them. And, you know, that's going to be a constant, I suppose, kind of paradoxical battle in the world of IT security. But, you know, most of us go out and use public Wi-Fi and, you know, do things that, you know, save all our, use all the same passwords, save them all to a password manager that isn't necessarily like, you know, the most locked one. And then, of course, I hear the other thing. Did you see there's a guy who has got 2 chances to remember his password to access 2 million in Bitcoin? Can't remember his password. So
oh my gosh, really?
You hear about this occasionally. Yeah, there's another case this week, I think.
Oh no.
So,
oh no.
You know, there's all these different levels of kind of like tech awareness and so on. Even my generation and your generation, yours, well, I say this, I find it interesting. I always want to say that the younger generation is more tech savvy, but actually when working with young people, I used to find that their tech savviness was quite like specific. So some of them were really like great on really like coding and things like that, and, you know, were buying dodgy stuff off the dark web and so on. Then we had the sort of, you know, the fact that you'd sit them down and be like, and this is how you get a capital letter on your keyboard. You know, yeah, certainly that idea that I think, you know, most people, a new generation will come through who are basically more aware than they are, and the people who are running things may not be at the forefront of what's going on in terms of technology.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know, maybe it's my age, maybe it's my lack of interest, but I don't know a great deal about, you know, how to get onto the dark web and things like that. But there was following the murder of Brianna Ghey, there's been a call out for essentially trying to limit the way in which young people can access the dark web, because that's what the killers did, but also that was something that was basically rife among for her and for her classmates, kind of seeing things that we wouldn't expect them to see. And it makes me realize that, you know, there's all these levels of sort of things that can be done with the internet. And one of these days I'm going to finish this book I'm reading at the moment, which is called Tech Feudalism: What Killed Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. Okay, put it in the notes. It's very large. So but one of the things that he's talking about there is this idea of kind of the shift of power into a capitalism that's no longer based on physical assets. It's based instead on digital, like cloud assets, basically. And the way in which that's, you know, shifting power and resource and changing like the face of late capitalism. So all of that conveys things around power, which brings us back to what you were saying about the bloke on the phone. You know, this heads up that George has got, that both that man, who we're told is, you know, at the forefront of defense contracts and things like that, you know, a billionaire in the business world, can give George a sort of tip-ish, an awareness of something that's going on. And so you've got these levels, only like the multi-billionaires who are able to react, if not foresee, then certainly react to something catastrophic coming. Then you've got somebody like in George's kind of privileged position who's on the fringe of that, so has a sort of secondary awareness of what's going on. And then you've got people like Amanda and Clay who would have had no idea what was going on had they not by chance, you know, met George. And even then, obviously, it's scanned. And then you've got obviously those people who essentially seem to have disappeared from the narrative because they're not in their houses. They're presumably in the city, which we can see as the center of sort of ongoing destruction. So a lot of levels of power there in that element. So we've got the sort of the fear level in terms of interrelation of people in the actual sort of specifics. And the other one that I wanted to mention was when Clay goes out driving, GPS doesn't work, gets completely lost, gets himself into quite a state, which maybe is fair. I don't know, not being able to find your way back in a situation where you don't know what's going to happen to you. I can see that. But he meets this Spanish speaking woman on the road. What did you make of that scene?
God, it was a bit. It kind of reminded me of sort of the beginning moments of The Last of Us, where they're sort of driving away, trying to escape this apocalyptic outbreak of disease from the main city, and sort of like drive past this family who's like bidding the car down to try and pull over. They sort of gave the same vibes as that, where Clay does pull over and he does try and communicate to this woman, and he rolls down the window and he's trying to speak to her. And again, I think that comes from his like sort of easygoing nature. But he eventually decides to drive off, and I think it's because of, again, I think it sort of goes back to these sort of like levels of sort of fear and stress that are accumulated, and I think his response was probably quite, I'd say, like normal for what the situation was. But he decides to drive off and leave this woman alone on her own, in the middle of the road. And I think he has quite a lot of guilt about that and confesses to Ruth.
Only after they've got stoned together.
After they got stoned together, yes. But I don't know. It's again hard sort of situation to be in, because
it is.
They're sort of bringing in an extra sort of factor, new stranger, new variable into this situation where, I think it's sort of, we later meet the character, what's his name?
Danny,
Danny, Danny, the next door neighbor. We later meet Danny, the next door neighbor, who has this sort of huge ethos about protecting his own and sort of looking out for himself. And I mean, at some point, that you sort of have to commit to that, especially in a place where there's like limited resources, and Amanda still has the sort of idea where she mentions an army base, thinking that the government's still going to provide for them.
That's right. It's the state will intervene.
That's not really the case anymore.
I think that raises some really interesting points. I mean, one of the things that I think is, for me, one of the biggest factors of this is this question that, yes, we've talked about, particularly with, say, yes, The Last of Us is a really good example, which is essentially this idea that in desperate situations, trust erodes, and if somebody is stopping you on the side of the road, you don't know whether they mean you harm or not. And this comes up a lot, I suppose, in post-apocalyptic narratives. I also think that it's just worth mentioning that what you've got there is obviously this Latina woman, probably a working class person within this very rich environment, I think is what we're sort of is implied. She doesn't have the big car, she doesn't have a car at all, as far as we can see. She doesn't seem to speak English, and of course Clay doesn't seem to speak any Spanish. So there's that communication. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because we're not told what the woman is saying in Spanish. My Spanish is far too weak to be able to follow something that is that sort of fast. And then I looked it up on the transcript, and it was just like, woman speaking Spanish. Like, okay, great. This person who wrote the transcript up didn't speak Spanish. I don't know. We're really, unless we're Spanish speakers, then obviously we're left in the same position as Clay. Like, this woman is obviously frantic, but his fear wins out rather than his interest to help her. And I think that this is one of the sort of the strengths of the film, and the way it explores, whether people are better together or better apart in these kind of apocalyptic situations, which of course is what, The Last of Us does as well, sort of breaking that kind of barrier. And it also made me think about a book that I put on our book recommendation on Instagram a few weeks ago, called The Future by Naomi Alderman, which is really, really good. I really liked it. But the thing that sort of I think is reflected here is it talks a lot about the survivalist community. And one of the things that it really draws on is this idea that for survival really to work, it has to function within communities. Actually, if you go it alone, then you will not survive. So quite counter to that sort of, and it really explores this idea of kind of people who go it alone, particularly the billionaires who create their special hideaways and bunkers and tech based protections and so on. So that's something that book really looks at in quite an interesting way. And yet we tend to see survivalists being like Bill in The Last of Us, or like Danny in Leave the World Behind. This idea that I'm now out for myself, I'm going to sort of lock the doors, and people who have previously been friends, neighbours, colleagues, these are people that I now won't even allow to approach my house and will only see them with a gun in hand. So that kind of links to the end of a bit just before the very end, but when George and Clay are talking about what's going on. So maybe we should sort of save that. But I think that we obviously see this dynamic of, are these two families stuck in the same house with the owners of the house having to sleep in the basement? Very nice basement suite, but obviously not in their own rooms. And we see the kind of like the development of that relationship moving between kind of tension and friendship, as you said, having a drink, or sharing some pot or whatever, and then something you like reminds them of the level of fear. So should we talk about the sort of the way in which we see them trying to, Amanda and her family trying to leave and then having to come back, because that I think is quite a strong moment in the sort of like a bit of a turning point in the film. Because I thought, we've mentioned this before, but this idea of kind of technology being controlled, I thought one of the things that I hadn't thought of that was really effective was the self-driving car scene.
Yeah, I think there's a clip of like Elon Musk reacting to that, which I actually didn't manage to get around to.
I was really surprised that they seem to have got Tesla branding.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Is that like all publicity is good publicity?
Don't know. Yeah, Tesla's not really painted the best light there. But yeah, no, I thought that was quite like an intense scene as well. I think they're really good at building tension in that sense. But yeah, so the family decides to sort of drive out and go to their like go to Amanda's sisters who lives in New Jersey, I think.
New Jersey, that's right. And they're like, oh, probably everything will be fine in New Jersey.
Which is kind of ignoring again that sort of like there's that sort of microcosm.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of, I think that it moves a lot between that sort of sense of like horrific apocalyptic fear towards the sort of desire to rationalize, to minimize. They will look back and laugh and so on, which is really effective. But yeah, so off they're going to try and get onto the expressway.
And they get there, and it's just a line of cars that have like, sort of seem to like be, bumper to bumper crashed into each other. And I think there's this sort of moment where like Amanda gets out the car to investigate, and she's sort of just thinking and observing. And like at the same time, it is sort of in this timeline where the audience itself is putting it together. And then I think again, and suddenly Clay sees this car coming down the freeway towards them, and he's like, oh my god, there's someone here, someone else we can communicate with, again coming out as like friendly nature. And then it's just that sinking feeling of like you realize sort of there's a sort of sweeping shot over a label where it's a self-driving car, and you're like, oh god. And it's I don't know, again it's all of these like sort of big vehicle events where like there's it's really quite scary, because even when the like oil tanker comes onto the shore, it's like hot, like huge little mini tsunami of water comes across and like digs up all the sand. And it's the same thing with the like plane, is like genuinely like effect on the landscape that could kill someone.
I mean when George is running from that plane and he's in the house and like the water just like tsunami goes through.
I'm sat there like initially being like, oh, that's nowhere near him, he's gonna be fine standing on the beach. And then suddenly the camera pans over and it's just like all the sand's getting like ripped up and the water's coming over the bank and everything. And I'm like, okay, never mind, good thing he started to.
And again, I think like sort of preceded by that sort of the gradual awareness of what's going on.
It's a very
and when he goes to pick up that watch from the sand,
oh god,
and there's a disembodied arm attached.
And as he sort of further explores, he sort of sees this like rubble and like then finds the dead body and then looks around. It's I don't know, it's very well revealed. But it's 100% that sort of every time building up that tension towards it. But and sort of obviously that's where the sort of implication of George's wife having not made it comes from.
Absolutely. And I think we see this interesting thing about kind of, again, the communication. We've said that communication is obviously a problem more widely. Even the sat phone doesn't work. A little snippet on the radio. We get obviously an emergency broadcast. We can talk about the leaflets perhaps in a moment, but we get sort of little snippets of things. And yet there's another level of disinformation, which is, you say, is the sort of, who reveals what to whom at different times. So the retaining of, holding things back, Clay not saying that he met somebody on the road, bearing in mind that there doesn't really seem to be anybody about, quite sure this is perhaps a community where lots of people have holiday properties and they're in their flats in the city, just the way that George and Ruth would have been. But there's no one really around, and yet there's also this fact that people don't tell each other things. And of course, what George is trying to do is to protect Ruth from the knowledge that planes are falling out of the sky. And Amanda goes and puts her foot in it and sort of reveals that. But of course, there's also this potential for kind of like infantilizing Ruth, and the question about whether you tell the children what is going on, the younger children. At what point does everybody have a right to know that the world is ending? Because in a way, it's sort of, we see the way that they're kind of like Archie and Rose interact with each other to sort of, show that they are aware that everything is falling apart, but they haven't really got, they want to rely on the adults, but the adults don't know what's going on either. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Shall we talk about young people, and then let's maybe come back to kind of the leaflets and the kind of background to the apocalypse and so on, because I think that one of the things that is interesting about this is the depiction of these young people. You've already mentioned that Ruth is fairly savvy. I think this is part a way of kind of challenging the sort of racist narrative where Amanda had said, oh, they're probably the handyman and the housekeeper or something like that, and then obviously the sophistication is supposed to bring her up short, as it were. But Ruth is also quite a sort of, I don't know, she feels like quite a sort of Gen Z sort of character in the way that she's painted. She's also, she's, aware of her, maybe less aware of her own privilege, but certainly is used much more wary, perhaps much more savvy, when she says to her father, something you've already mentioned, but I've got the quote here. I'm asking for you to remember that if the world falls apart, trust should not be doled out easily to anyone, especially white people. But she's also sort of been delaying taking her place in the world. And again, this felt like a really kind of like link to things we talked about before, with like a sort of at the end of our last episode about sort of the treatment of Gen Z, when she says, I'm still figuring my shit out, trying not to rush into anything. The last thing that I want is to be sucked into a career that I regret 10 years from now, by which point I will be trapped by the pressure to stay the course because I'll be too old to re-enter the workforce.
I mean, that's definitely, I think, I kind of feel like there's almost 3 generations in this house. Is like sort of, you've got the millennials of Gen X, the Gen Z represented by Ruth.
I was wondering about that. They feel older than older millennials, really. Young Gen X.
I feel like sort of Archie and Rosie, sort of the younger two, so that's 13 to 16, sort of, considering the fact that we think it's set slightly more into the future, it makes sense that there'd be kind of this new emergence of like Gen Alpha. So Amanda sort of says this bit, which we're going to quote, about the tanker, like when they get home after this, sort of this huge boat washes up on the beach, that her and Claire sort of worrying about it, trying to find out what happened. And then she says, meanwhile, the kids seem to have completely gotten over it, like it was something they saw on a show. They're on the next episode.
That's a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know. I think there's a bit of a sort of tendency for like these script writers to kind of infantilize and sort of almost, I don't know, hone in on this sort of like bringing these younger kids on the internet, and that it's sort of like we have all, everyone's got this sort of episodic little minds, and it's all about dopamine and sort of getting onto the next big trend and stuff. But I don't know, I think there is elements of that, and also I feel like Gen Alpha isn't really old enough to we're not really ready to see what the effects of like such a overly online and sort of digital upbringing is gonna, like what sort of effects that's gonna have.
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on just kind of like how much they sort of don't know about like older technology. Like she's like, what do they call it when they keep showing old shows?
Yeah,
and things like that. And I was thinking, that feels a bit, I don't know, it doesn't feel very realistic. But as you say, maybe if we're a little bit further, sort of 10, 20 years down the line, maybe
there's a huge thing about sort of, I don't know, older generations being like, oh, the younger generations don't know how to write a check or something like that. I think I saw some sort of sketch about that, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe I do know how to write a check. Well, I do know how to write a check personally, but also like this is outdated technology. Like, do you know how to use a gramophone? No, because it's outdated.
Actually, I do, because I
raised my hands to you, Claire. I tipped my
you
hat.
are right. It is very outdated. I had to learn, and I think that it's you're quite right. What's the point with things that are basically obsolescent? Yeah. And I think that, there's I think that's an interesting thing, because you're right. On the one hand, I think there is an infantilizing of them, and there's a bit of a reductionist element, because like Archie's characterized basically by buying like a hormonal teenager who takes non-consensual pictures of Ruth in her bikini. But then there's, with Rose, there's her obsession with friends, which I think, although like the first time I watched it, I was like, this is really not believable, because yes, people get into old shows, of course they do, but a child of that age getting into Friends, particularly when it's, it was absolutely seminal for my generation, but even though I can look back on it with a sort of certain nostalgia, I also can see just how like really dated and potentially problematic, but maybe it's supposed to reflect something. I mean, Ruth, I think, calls it nostalgia for a time that never existed. She questions this. So maybe it is supposed to say something about kind of this family and the way in which they're kind of not fully sort of up to date, doesn't seem quite right, but like fully like aware of prejudices we've said already, but also kind of like maybe it shows Rose's kind of discomfort of the world in which she lives. She wants to go back to something, and that I thought was a really interesting aspect, because if we take the opposite view, rather than saying that they're infantilized, when we see Archie and Rose together, they're actually they're ignorant on plenty of things, like all wild animals ever, because they're so city kid kind of thing, but they're also like actually quite existentially aware, I think, and it's to remember that level of sort of existential dread that really pervades a generation growing up in a time of environmental collapse and the challenges of a late capitalist society for a young workforce, and these kinds of things. These are very, very real and very manifest in the mental health issues that pervade people of your age and younger, I suppose. So I felt there was a little bit of awareness of that, really, and certainly I think that the kids seem quite a bit more grown up when they're sort of seen on their own. I think it's when Rose is trying to explain what it is that she saw with the deer when she first sees them in the morning. And she's like, this morning I saw deer, not a deer, a fuck lot of deer, 100 deer. It's like, because she thinks there's no point telling her parents, because her parents won't pay any attention. And that I thought was another really interesting thing. They quite want the kids just to go off and do their thing, be in the pool, not engage in the adult conversations, and so on. Should we talk about animals then?
Yes.
Buckler of deer.
Buckler of deer, yes. I think there's quite a bit of like a environmental sort of effect of this sort of cyber attack, which I don't think it's fully explained at all. Like,
no, we get that tiny like Clay manages to get a tiny bit of radio, and he's like,
where they're like
fallout that's led to a catastrophic environmental disaster
impacting animal migration patterns, which I was really interested. I was watching it and I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a bit of googling around this. Maybe there's sort of like they've taken some sort of scientific explanation and put it into the film, and it's actually all true. Which I need to like further do research on, because I don't know. I thought they were going to explain it, but they never really get into it. I wonder what the sort of reason behind that is. But yeah, in the film, we see all sorts of animals that seem to be like moving across this land that, Amanda and Clay and their children are like, near the house that they're living in, where there's loads and loads of these deer, in the hundreds and the fuck ton loads. that sort of just appear. Well, I see the thing. My confusion is they reoccur throughout this movie, so clearly they're not migrating very far. They keep coming back.
No, exactly, and I think that there's a question there, isn't it? Did they suddenly sprint up to this particular bit of land? But I suppose what we are supposed to be thinking is like, so we get the deer, which to start with, you're like, okay, yeah, woodland and so on. I mean, where I've lived, lots of places with deer, and occasionally my parents get them in their garden and stuff. Quite nice to see and so on, but not something that you would worry about too much. And then they get the flamingos, which land in their pool, and you're like, okay, a bit weird, but also cool pink birds landing in and so on, and we see a load of geese going overhead at one point. So it's like there's a lot of animals and kind of not in the place that you'd expect them to be, but it's not like wolves have suddenly invaded or lions or bears or something. These are basically animals that are sort of on the surface harmless. And I don't think we get an explanation necessarily for it, but it does certainly do a lot to add to the kind of horror movie element.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So the deer are genuinely really menacing.
They quite are.
Do you think were they real deer or CGI deer?
Absolutely not real. There was now no point.
I didn't think you could get that many sinister looking deer.
Not at all. They were very sinister looking. I was quite unsettled, but no, it was. I think it was this because they had these sort of 3 different scenes of sort of Amanda and Ruth absolutely ballistically screaming at these deer to back them away, and then I think the most intense part was George and Clare when they were at neighbor Danny's house trying to ask for the medicine, and sort of when the weapons get pulled out. One thing that I did question was how, in the same way that, for example, in The Last of Us, that people take advantage of sort of the commotion to wreak havoc, there wasn't really any of that. You didn't really see anyone out there sort of looting or taking advantage of all this commotion.
Is that just a product of the fact that they're basically in this sort of little hamlet? There's only one way in and out.
True.
And there's an interesting moment, I think, at the end or towards the end when we just see Ruth staring, then Amanda goes to join her. We're thinking, is it more deer? What is it? And it's the city in the distance, the mushroom cloud over it. So that is a really clever kind of juxtaposition of kind of the fear of, yes, okay, you could be trampled by a herd of deer and you could absolutely be killed by the big stag that was kind of at the front, but that kind of fear versus somebody's dropped an atomic bomb.
I think they said about radiation.
They do mention about radiation as well, and again with it's that unknown, isn't it? Because Archie we know gets bitten by a tick or something, but then of course there's also a sonic attack.
Does Lyme disease cause the falling out of teeth? Didn't think it did.
I mean, it can manifest in a number of different ways, but it's often, my understanding is it's linked with the same condition. Well, not linked with, but it's similar to the condition that I have to ME, in which your teeth do not fall out. I'm pleased to report. I know it's one of the things they test for when they're sort of trying to define these sort of quite challenging chronic illnesses. So I think we're led to think maybe it was a tick, maybe it was an insect, but I think it's much more likely that Archie said he didn't put his hands over his ears fast enough.
Yes, yeah.
And the next thing his teeth have come loose and he's vomiting in a gross way. So maybe it's 2 things.
Yeah.
But it's difficult, isn't it? Because with Danny, you're like, okay, so he is a survivalist, again, there's an element of sort of both this sort of panic prepping, but also this kind of an element of privilege because he can buy up all the bottled water and so on. But there's also kind of conspiracy theory elements to him, isn't there? So can we trust him when he's sort of saying, sound waves carrying radiation, microwaves, some physics stuff that I probably should have checked before this.
Definitely. I mean, also my question is, they just give Archie some random pills. What have you given him? Paracetamol? I don't you don't know what it is. You're not. I mean, I get it is that sort of,
that cost $1,000.
Some $1,000 pills, but I mean, again, it's always that question of when you're in those situations where someone needs medical attention, what are you going to do? They're effectively trapped where they are.
You can't even, no Dr. Google or anything. So there is, I think there's a fear element, and of course, if he's got an infection, then yes, antibiotics, whatever, it would be a good thing to be able to give him. But if this is his teeth falling out because his head has been shaken by this noise, then presumably all you can do is, get some false teeth and get it. So yeah, I think it raises obviously this really important question about how reliant we are on not just the state, but the whole kind of construction of society and people, who do things for us. So it's a very vivid way of looking at that. And to pick up on another thing you said, this way in which there's a really interesting balance with the guns thing. So when they're sort of standing, off the doorstep, because they're not allowed on the doorstep of Danny's house, and he's got his shotgun, and then George pulls his handgun, and then you've just got Clay jumping up and down in the middle, asking them not to fight. There's something almost kind of comedic about it, and I thought that this film did do well to balance the kind of really horrific with the sort of slightly cringe.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was a good moment, and Clay going, "I'm just a useless weak man. You're a proper man." and likewise when Amanda and George are dancing, and the embarrassing sort of middle-aged dancing, and very cute.
It was very cute.
But then immediately followed by the alarm.
No, my one weird qualm was in the little dancing bit where George and Amanda were having a bit of bond. Suddenly it's whoa, they're the sexual tension. I was this has come out. No, whoa.
It was the vast amount of drinking that they'd been doing.
Okay.
And I think again, there's something about this kind of, I think that's what it was supposed to be, this unusual situation. And there is that kind of, what would you do in an apocalypse?
Yeah.
Well, if there's partly the sort of rational trying to find things out and to do things and sort of fill the bathtub and so on. And then there's the kind of drink all the expensive wine that you were saving for a special occasion, not much point for that anymore. And generally try and sort of feel a bit better about things. It's the same as when we were talking about the society, the first night, what do? They all get completely wasted and trashed.
Yes.
So okay, so we talked about sort of hopped around here. I think that one of the things that we should talk about is basically this idea of the potential situation of what has actually gone on, because we don't get any clear answers, and I think that we're supposed to experience that along with everybody else in the film.
Yes.
But obviously we get leaflets being dropped in, again, a really good kind of slightly scary scene where Clay is trying to outrun.
I mean, it was quite scary. I think it was scary in the sense that you couldn't quite tell from it. Again, it's that slow sort of approach of this huge sort of sizable vehicle. Just stuff. I was is this sort of some sort of chemical warfare suddenly? It was scary. I think I don't know. I think it was more anxiety was also accelerated by the fact that Clay's reaction to just turning his car around and going the other way. I was what is he running from? Is this downfall of Red? What is it? But then it sort of gets close and you see these little bits of A5 bits of paper and stuff. So but I think the sort of really scary bit about that hits when Danny shares his insider knowledge that he was I'll tell you this for free, where he says, "Oh, it's the Koreans," and they go, "Oh no, but we think it's the Iranians or something." And they're sort of oh, and it sort of starts clicking for George what that sort of is going on. There's misinformation stuff that's going on.
I think again there's a really strong sense of bringing up the fear of the sort of the other, because we've got these dropping of leaflets which are in Arabic, and the only person who can read Death to America is Archie, because he's been playing some video game with it in. So there's that kind of oh, this is something we can't read, it's foreign, it's in a script that we can't understand, we've got no way of finding out what's written on it. So there's that kind of it's a very Anglophone fear that I think, combined with the Spanish situation and so on, it's, we see lots of kind of, if it's not made available to us in English, we can't do anything about it. And then, Danny saying that, oh, my friend found leaflets and they were either in Korean or Chinese, he couldn't tell which. And again, that sort of level of other sort of all Eastern cultures.
Homogenizing everything.
So, I think that again I think it's perhaps quite reflective of a growing view in, well, certainly kind of America under Trump, and therefore maybe it's coming back of this idea of basically America for America, and increasingly, like Trump sort of, the risk of withdrawing America from NATO, and these kinds of things where basically America becomes more and more sort of potentially insular, and therefore is potentially a greater threat from not only other forces, but also its perception of the other forces, that everybody becomes an enemy.
I know. I think that's what what George sort of says is like, or like Clay says, America's made a lot of enemies or something. That you again, it's kind of, it's almost a bit like their own sort of doing sort of thing, where you wouldn't know who, if you had a feud with one person and then suddenly this like terrible occurrence that's been set up happens to you, you're gonna be like, oh, I wonder who that is. But when everyone around you isn't a big fan, then you can't ultimately decipher who may be at fault.
And I think that there's obviously this sort of America feeling that it's made lots of enemies, but there's also, of course, the other sort of scary elements, which, so I think Danny mentions the Russians having withdrawn their ambassadors. So, this idea that, did Russia know, is thrown in there as well. And then you've got, like, George is talking about basically the impact on the markets and the way in which there were sort of unexpected fluctuations in the markets that he felt meant something was happening.
Don't really know what that means. Markets, money. Not really sure.
I mean, I suppose what we're seeing there is this idea that, of kind of wanting to, like, his client wanting to remove, to move his money, so sort of an awareness of places that are going to lose their stability. So maybe if America is going to collapse, you don't want your money invested in, well, you don't really want it invested in the dollar. You don't want it invested in American stocks and shares. So, I think that there's a sense that, is there somebody, if somebody knows something, then certain people who have powerful connections will learn it. And it's this thing about basically, you can't predict the future, but you can see, I suppose, which way the wind is blowing. And of course, also, if you're in the very powerful elite, there's this question about how much do you make the future as well, because if you control vast swathes of the market, and so on. But George argues, before his final realization, that it's not about an evil cabal at all. It's actually about the fact that really everything is just right on the cusp of chaotic potential all the time. This idea that no one is in control, no one is pulling the strings. I was talking about the X-Files and my current X-Files binge watch, and they are exploring the idea of this kind of like international group outside of government who holds this power and kind of are the ones who actually decide what happens in the world. And it's a very popular theory, but in many ways George's theory is much scarier and also, I think, really quite feasible, really, probably more feasible in a way. So, I mean, the very final thing that George kind of put pieces together from all of these things that he's, like, from his work and from what's going on, is the 3-stage program for how to destabilize a country.
Because my primary client works in the defense sector, I spent a lot of time studying the cost-benefit analysis of military campaigns. There was one program in particular that terrified my client the most. A simple 3-stage maneuver that could topple a country's government from within. First stage was isolation. Disable their communication and transportation. Make the target as deaf, dumb, and paralyzed as possible. Setting them up for the second stage. Synchronized chaos. Terrorize them with covert attacks and misinformation. Overwhelming their defense capabilities, leaving their weapon systems vulnerable to extremists in their own military. Without a clear enemy or motive, people would start turning on each other. Done successfully, the third stage would happen on its own. What's the third stage? A coup d'etat. Civil war. Collapse.
I don't know. I don't know how much of it is fictionalized for this specific movie, but it sounds. I don't know. That's intense. I think it was. I don't know. It made a lot of sense. I think, but yeah, no. I definitely think. I don't know. Oh God, I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah, I think that you're right. It becomes very convincing within this world where we see that the way that fear can take hold so easily. And I think that we kind of feel the same, like, I don't know, would we have let George and Ruth into the house? What would have happened if you hadn't? There's lots here, I think, about the sort of this question of how would you behave in this scenario, and quite quickly this idea that that fear that we get throughout the film, kind of sharing in the fear of the characters, does make us think how fast things could break down. It is compelling. I mean, I suppose coup d'etat or civil war or whatever, you've still got somebody basically planning the creation of a vacuum into which they can step. I think that what's significant is just how, if we think that cyber attacks are the next great risk, how easily you could create that first step could come about. Now, maybe I'm not giving enough credit to kind of our cyber defenses and so on, but it does seem quite plausible. And that leads us into the question about kind of people and whether we think that people are kind of what Amanda thinks they are, because I think that's really at the heart of a lot of this. Are people as bad as she thinks they are? I mean, this is a brilliant bit when we first meet her and she's like looking out the window and she's saying, I was watching everybody starting their day and all their kind of like verve and tenacity, and I felt so lucky to be part of the world. And then I remembered what the world is actually like, and I came to a more accurate realization. I fucking hate people. I'm like very sympathetic of this. But what the big speech that I think we can put in a quote of is the one that Amanda makes to Ruth when she's talking about like the fact that she works in advertising, and advertising is all about selling things to people by understanding who they are, and therefore how you can make them buy something that they don't need or want.
Every day, all day, my whole job is to understand people well enough so that I know how to lie to them, so I can sell them things they don't really want. And when you study people like that, when you really see the way they treat each other, well, you're no dummy. You see what they do, and they do it without even thinking about it. Fuck. I did it to you and your dad, and I don't even really know why. We fuck each other over all the time without even realizing it. We fuck every living thing on this planet over and think it'll be fine because we use paper straws and order the free-range chicken. And the sick thing is, I think deep down we know we're not fooling anyone. I think we know we're living a lie, an agreed upon mass delusion to help us ignore and keep ignoring how awful we really are.
Oof. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Actually, I think it always comes down to a bit of that like capitalist individualism, especially when it comes just sort of around the ideas of like being out there for yourself and sort of like wanting up the next person, sort of giving yourself the upper hand over someone else, like at someone else's expense, and also sort of like a bit of more of her commentary around how people try to alleviate their own guilt around in terms of the world, and sort of its makeup sort of breaking down a bit with the sort of free range eggs and the paper straws and stuff. And I mean, again, there's that whole entire narrative around climate change, around the like carbon footprint, which was like created by big companies anyway to sort of like redirect blame onto the individual about their own sort of life habits, being at like sort of at blame for the way that our climate is developing. But it's very cynical worldview, but I could probably see like in that sort of like hyper capitalistic marketing sort of atmosphere. I can understand like why she views the world in the way that she does. But I think, especially in this, like, she's like, you know, sort of been given this opportunity and situation where she's like brought these strangers into her sort of life now, this situation going forward, and especially like I think getting to know George and like speaking to her like him has probably opened her up a bit more to sort of understanding that people can sort of help each other out. Because I think, like, funnily enough, at the end of the day, I think taking George and Ruth into that house that they were staying in was hugely beneficial for their survival.
Yeah.
You know, and it sort of helped them out in the end, and they're sort of helping each other.
Absolutely. I mean, as a speech, it reminds me quite a bit of in Years and Years, that amazing speech by Anne Reid's character, where she said it's all your fault. And you know, I don't want to be like Julia Roberts' character here, but I think that and I hope that, you know, that kind of bitterness isn't something that has kind of like sunk quite as much into my character. But everything about this speech just feels like I really don't want to believe that this is the case, in the same way that I don't want to believe that in an apocalypse, I hope that more people would be letting George and Ruth in than being like Danny. But I've got a horrible feeling, as you say, that we've built up a culture that really does not prepare us well for stepping into that world of kind of community and serving one another and diversity, and not just, you know, looking out for number one and so on. So yeah, there is a lot that I think about that environmental narrative as well that I think is really, really significant and does fit very nicely into this idea of corporate advertising, and the way in which that's made her so cynical. And it's interesting because I think I mentioned before this fantastic book by John Alexander called Citizen, and he starts off that book talking about how he left his career in advertising to basically work with a non-profit and set that up and so on. And he you know, the figures there about like how many times you get bombarded every day with people trying to sell you things, and basically that he, I suppose, went on a similar journey to this character, but it led to him making these big changes in his life and the things that matter to him. And you wonder whether there's something of the same kind of arc happening, hopefully. Not that, you know, everything now presumably is going to be about survival and so on, but okay, right, the ending. I don't mind the ending, but as you said, lots of people have a problem with it. So to describe the ending for people.
So, you know, after all this, you know, George and Clay have gone with Archie to go get him some medical help, and Ruth and Amanda have gone to look for Rosie. We eventually find out where Rosie's gotten to, and sort of the camera zones in on this house. I think it's like the Thorn sets or something.
Yes, it's the house that there's basically backs on to sort of
yes,
they're staying in, isn't it? So yes,
yeah,
kind of neighbours across the way.
Neighbours across the way that Danny mentions has this sort of big rich person underground apocalyptic bunker. And we sort of, you know, pan into this house down the corridor, and we have this munching. Rosie's there, enjoying herself, having the best time. And she sort of explores the house a little bit, finds this bunker, goes down there, and you know, it's all fully equipped. It's all set. They've got the bunker, like bunk beds, they've got, you know, the tables, the kitchen, electronics going. They're even getting some sort of information through some sort of system. We're not sure why the computer works. Probably some
no, but I suspect that it's to do with the fact that these, you know, these companies do exist that basically, you know, set up these bunkers, and presumably you know, for the vast amount of money that is paid, it hotlines you into some sort of, you know, post-apocalyptic network that at least gives emergency alerts. And
yes, something. Exactly. And then I think the most important part of the whole movie, finds the TV, finds all the box sets, and I think there's a bit of a bit throughout the movie where Rosie, you know, having been obsessed with Friends, is fully exasperated at the fact that she can't seem to finish the last episode.
That's
and
right.
She finally gets her hands on it. I think it's a pretty clever way to finish off, and like kind of leaves it on a bit more of a lighthearted note.
I think Archie really does challenge Rosie over, like, what is it that you like about friends or whatever, you really care about their relationships. And she does say, they make me happy, and I really need that right now. If there's any hope left in this fucked up world, I want to at least find out how things turn out for them. I care about them, which I think for a lot of people watching Friends the first time, will Ross and Rachel, finally get back together and stay together, and so on? What will happen? That was kind of where they how they managed to kind of culminate the show. And again, it's this thing about, I suppose, there's an individualism to it insofar as she has decided that what is important to her is to meet her particular need, not to sit around being scared and so on, but basically to take herself into hopefully finding some other way, a DVD, and they've got a good selection of DVDs to keep them going through an apocalypse. I thought a bit weird that there's lots of seasons of Buffy, but I didn't see first seasons, so that would be frustrating, as you know. There's a positive thing to it, isn't it? I mean, God knows what's happened to these poor people. Presumably they've been bombed in the city, and that's that. So there's a sort of a bit of an irony that you're terribly rich and privileged and you build yourself a bunker, but when the time comes, you don't have the time to get there, which is another thing that is explored in this book, The Future. This idea that you can build bunkers as much as you like, but if the apocalypse goes down, how are you going to get a plane that gets you to New Zealand or rural Scotland or whatever? How are you going to get there? How would you be able to predict it happening? And the basic thing is, I think, as George says, well, the very rich might get a bit of a heads up, but that's about as good as it gets. But you're right, it has a more lighthearted note. We can't know what's going to happen next, but I think that's not the point of the film. The point of the film is not the apocalyptic fallout, it's that the tension and the interpersonal relationships at the moment that things start to disintegrate. And of course they're all headed to the same place. They are, there's a positive message that that hopefully they will be okay. And I suppose it's another one of those kind of narratives that basically says, in the time of an apocalypse, you might think that being really wealthy is what's going to make a difference. But of course, we've already had the kind of, is $1,000 in cash actually worth anything anymore? Buys you one bottle of medicine. So obviously completely, it's proper free market capitalism.
Yes.
Supply and demand. But what does money mean anything? We're just moving to a barter system. And the same thing, you're really rich, you've built a bunker, but is there something morally wrong with somebody else moving into it if you're not there?
No, I wouldn't think so. I think it's kind of in this like post-apocalyptic situation, like resources are resources. I think it's kind of fair play. I think that's probably the most ethical way to take those things anyway.
So would you support looting then?
Do you know what? Sure. I'm going to go out on a limb here on the podcast. You heard it here first. Everyone for themselves in the apocalypse.
I mean, so this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, I think it's a really interesting one. We've got this, the social contract is basically entirely based on ideas of property law, right? Ultimately. And what we're saying is that in such a situation, we can automatically basically say that property law, obviously both in a sort of philosophical way and in an actual legal way, more obviously, no longer applies, and it's sort of everyone for themselves to some degree. But then I think that other people will probably say, well, the moment you start saying that, well, it's a bit like well, I don't know, squatters' rights and things like that, a whole sort of other aspect. Empty property, is it anyone's right to, if we've got a homelessness situation, is it your right to move into a property? We might well say yes, it is, but that's certainly not the way that the law stands. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think that we're not given an opportunity really to think to sort of see the ramifications of that. But I suppose if the people are not there, they're not using it. I would feel that it's absolutely fine, but I also know people who are very, very keen on the idea of maintaining property kind of ideas at all times. So, okay, the big question, what do you take away from this film? Is there a message?
Oh, it's a lot to unpack. I feel like ultimately it sort of reflects a bit more about like probably like the fragility of our sort of modern civilization and the like reliance on technology, because ultimately this dystopia isn't sort of this like, you know, biological disease that comes along or this sort of big war authoritarian government that's sort of clamping down on people's freedoms. It's down to the fact that our whole lives sort of orientate around technology. And where that sort of, you know, that's where the root problem starts appearing. Yeah, and sort of the fear of the unknown and sort of how isolation can lead to exacerbated fear. And, you know, that I'd say those are sort of like the main takeaways. And also, like, I think the commentary on the racial and sort of socio-economic divides.
Yeah. So something about if you allow fear to pervade. So if you allow fear to pervade and kind of dominate your interactions with others in society, based on prejudice and based on individualism, then ultimately you are worse off for it. So, you know, I think it's not perhaps as clear cut as that, because some might say Danny's better off, but I'm not sure that we're left thinking he is. I mean, he's sort of a bit of a sad, isolated man.
Yes.
You know, he and his family are sort of confined to their house with holding up guns to everybody who comes. You know, I don't think it's something we would desire, but yeah. So I think there's a good message there about sort of, we might have got ourselves into a state where we really feel that we hate people, but actually there's coming back from that. And maybe also in the scenario when confronted with a fucklot of deer, jumping up and down and shouting at them is apparently a very, very effective way of dissuading them. So, you know, when the apocalypse comes and the deer rise up, then we'll have one small way of dealing with this. So really interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Masha. So I can't remember what we're doing next in 2 weeks' time.
I want to say it's downsizing.
Oh yes, so that was your suggestion.
Yes, I have literally just seen a clip of this, so maybe we'll watch it and find out it's really bad. But it seemed like it had some good concepts to talk about.
I think that's all right. Well, we can do really bad
about, like, you know, sort of human rights and stuff. So yeah, it should be a fun one. I think it'll be a good one.
Cool. Okay, so downsizing in 2 weeks after the release of this. So this comes out on the 18th.
Yep.
And then we will have a newsletter on the 25th. So do subscribe to our Substack. Check that out on our Instagram, or go to Substack and find Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. And yes, then it will be into March. So we will be downsizing at the beginning of March on the 3rd. Very exciting times. Check out Instagram for things like book recommendations and updates on what we're doing. That is Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs. That's our handle. And if you are imagining what life in a survivalist compound might be like, you can go to beingsociety.com and you can play our sort of philosophical game of what would you do, which I think also applies quite nicely for Leave the World Behind and what would you do. So if you want to let us know what would you do, then please email us dystopianfictioncurrentaffairs@gmail.com. And you can also donate if you feel so inclined. There's a coffee link in our Instagram bio. Thank you everyone very much for listening, and we will see you soon.